I've been working on building a HeavyHaul toter home, which will consist of a very large, comfortable living quarters and also have the ability to tow anything to hook up to. To do so, I'll be combining a whole bunch of different parts I've been collecting from a whole bunch of different trucks, and all of these parts will be combined into the ultimate tow rig. Starting up front, we'll be using this 1978 Ford cab over cab. I've already gutted the whole interior, and this cab is going to be completely redone and refurbished. I'll also work on rebuilding this front steer axle, so we'll be able to reuse it for our toter home project. So first, let's work on tearing down this cab over and pull off the parts we'll be using, take off the cab and the front axle, and we'll rip out the engine while we're at it. I'm not going to use this engine because it's too old of an engine to ever be able to put out the amount of power that I'm looking for this project. So that's why we'll be swapping in a more modern engine. We'll jack up this whole cab first because it would be really hard otherwise to get to the front mounting hardware that this cab hooks onto. I'm also going to be pulling this matching steer axle off of this parts cab so we can have twin steer for the toter home for the added weight capacity, the added safety, and the extra cool factor in my opinion. I also have these two matching sets of rear axles. Now this particular axle is missing some parts, but we don't need it because we're going to put this axle here with the pass-through diff in front of that set, and then we'll have a true tri-drive for this setup. And then a fun fact, these two sets actually also came from other Ford cab overs. That doesn't make a difference because these are just Rockwell axles that you could find under different brands of semi-trucks. So it doesn't make a difference that these came from Ford cab overs, but just a fun fact. But that was just a fun coincidence that worked out. Because these two sets had some bad rust. Like really bad. These were really rotting away. So that's why these axles were removed from those Ford cab overs, and then they got replaced by just a whole back half of frame from another semi-truck being spliced onto those trucks. However, all the suspension components are not corroded at all, so that'll all be good to go. And this suspension design will be perfect for this HeavyHaul toter home because this is probably the strongest setup, where you have this arm pivoting there, running underneath the axle, and then being supported by your airbag in the back. And this is the most common suspension design that I've seen across HeavyHaul trucks. And they're technically not the smoothest riding, but they are the strongest and most robust air ride setup. And they're air rides, so they'll still have good ride quality to them anyways. The toter home frame will be two of these heavy duty military frames from two trucks. They'll be spliced together, so we'll have enough length. I already took one set of frame rails off to a sandblasting company to get them sandblasted. However, they still haven't gotten to them, so that's kind of delayed me getting these frames situated, but let's disassemble this the rest of the way real quick, separate these axles from the frame so we can get this frame off to the sandblaster anyways, and then as soon as those frames are blasted, I'll be ready to fabricate them together. I'm not actually going to continue to use any of this top glass side skirting, so while the cab was up, I got to all that hardware. I think this might be ready to wiggle out of here. Probably won't fight me. Alright. There it finally goes. I don't think anything actually broke either. And then now I'm going to undo these three main bolts holding the whole frame of the cab to this whole hinge mount here. However, these are all huck bolts, which is basically a giant rivet. So I'm going to have to cut through them instead of being able to unscrew them. Okay, I pulled this side skirt off, removed the steering shaft, and cut through everything else that was connected to this cab to this lower part of the truck. So now this whole cab's just precariously poised with just these cut pins through these holes. So now let's let this back down, and then we can pull this out of the shop and pull this cab off. Yeah, having those side skirts removed really puts it into perspective how much higher these Ford cab overs are than most other cab overs, which I love being that high up on the road. I guess they had to go that extra height to fit in this air ride system front and rear. So that's why I love these Ford cab overs. They have the most plush cab ever with airbags on all four corners, floating this whole thing down the road like a cloud. Okay, I do have this cab strapped up to the excavator in a way that keeps the straps angled away from the cab. That way they won't pinch on the cab at all. These back two straps are just wrapped around the main ram up there. There's nowhere else really to hook in that area, so that'll work fine. So now all that's left, I removed all the pins that we tackled on that hinge area. So now I just need to unlock these cab jacks. You see those locking pins coming out. This side too. And now this will separate on its own now. So I think we're ready to try to lift. Now that this truck is pushed back in the shop, we can work on actually removing this front axle. There's this big old bracketry we need to free up from the frame. And then we'll also pull the radiator and the engine and trans out of this frame while we're at it. Now I'm going to remove the rest of these body panels to get easier access to disassembling the rest of the front half of this truck. So grill, bumper, and these fiberglass corners all getting removed. And none of that stuff is going to be reused for the ToterHome. I'm going to tie all these things into one custom, unique, complete redesign of this front end that I think will look really rad and give it a completely different demeanor and presence to it than this stock design does. I'll keep this 9000 though, that's kind of collectible. Let me get this AC condenser out of here. This truck actually has all these louvers that'll close shut to block air going through the radiator when the engine is too cold, and it even operates automatically to where it automatically closes if the coolant temperature is too cold. So I'm trying to get it to free up. It's a little bit seized up. There it goes. This is operated by air. I can charge up this piston and leak it back out. That actually works pretty good now. Alright, I drained all the coolant, and I think I have just about everything unhooked from this radiator, so let's see if it's ready to pop out. I have no idea how heavy it is, so I'm wondering if it's something I can manhandle. Oh, probably not, to be honest with you. I think I need to get a ratchet strap to help me out with this. I have this ratchet strap involved now, so let's try this again. I have my lifting strap hooked to this excavator over here, so now I'm able to guide this radiator away from the truck. So now I think I can let it down. Alrighty, this thing was heavy. Let's see if I can waddle it out of the shop. Check it out. You guys only ever see me in work clothes covered in grease and dirt, but now I have some new high-end attire thanks to Huckberry, who's the sponsor of today's video. Huckberry is a lifestyle and outdoor retailer that acts as a one-stop men's shop for the highest quality apparel, footwear, content, and gear with best-in-class products and brands, which I have really been wanting some high-end linen clothes to enjoy in these summer months since linen is so comfortable and breathable and even a much healthier option compared to all the synthetic fibers we seem to be surrounded by these days. And Huckberry had exactly what I was looking for with these linen pants and shirt found in their summer collection. But I didn't stop there because one of their house brands called Flint and Tinder has such a nice selection, ranging from these light linen shorts to this thick rugged trucker jacket and everything in between. So click the link in my description below to go shop at Huckberry. They have all sorts of good stuff that I think you fellas would really enjoy for this summer and beyond. And thank you, Huckberry, for sponsoring today's video. Okay, I'm working on the excavator now because it has been a critical tool with lifting all these heavy things I have around here. And it's not 100% healthy right now. Here's our issue. You can see some green milkiness to our oil. And that's because we're getting some coolant mixing in with our oil, which technically there's a lot of different areas in this engine that gets coolant and oil right next to each other. So I've been doing some troubleshooting to figure out where that leak is. I pulled off my upper and lower radiator hoses and put caps in them and put a valve stem up in this top one so I can pressurize it with air. So then we don't have to pressurize the radiator. So that pressurizes the coolant system with air. And then I could hear a slight hissing. So that would be our leak where our coolant is normally passing by something. But it was really hard to track down where this hissing was happening. First I pulled off the oil cooler and then made some little block off plates in order to bypass that loop of the cooling system to where once that was blocked off and I pressurized it, if we still had a leak, then that means our oil cooler was fine and our leak is somewhere else, which that was the case. The leak still happened. The leak continued on even with the oil cooler bypassed. So then next thing I looked at was the air compressor, which this engine has no need for an air compressor, but literally this engine relies on having an air compressor to carry the gear train to drive the water pump. So all these engines came with an air compressor, whether you needed it or not. And air compressors do have oil and coolant mixing through them, and sometimes that could be a failure point. However, when I removed it and pressurized the system, it kept on hissing, which then could only be two other things. Either the head gasket or technically the water pump is another spot where oil and coolant are next to each other because this is a gear-driven water pump. Because you have this gear driving the water pump and it has a seal separating the crankcase from the coolant system. And to cut to the chase, that was the issue, which is good news that our head gasket wasn't the issue. And when I removed this air compressor, you can see the water pump gear right there is very clearly hissing out of this seal right here. But let me tell you more about this water pump because it gets quite entertaining as to why it was pushing coolant into our oil. So this is a 9.4 liter engine, and it's very common on your bigger diesels to have a gear-driven water pump. So with a belt-driven water pump, you have a belt on the outside and you have a seal that seals the shaft of the pulley. So if the seal fails, you just leak coolant onto the ground and you can notice the leak that way. But on a gear-driven water pump, instead of having an external pulley, you have an internal gear. So if your seal fails, then coolant will push past that seal into the gear case and into your whole crankcase, mixing with your oil. But that's why gear-driven water pumps are designed with what's called a weep hole. So how that works is you have your water pump turbine and then a seal and then a little cavity that comes before your gear. And in that cavity, there's a drain hole at the bottom. So if your seal fails and coolant starts pushing in towards the crankcase, it gets caught in this cavity and then just leaks out a drain hole rather than pushing through into your crankcase all the way. However, my weep hole wasn't weeping. The seal did wear out to where it was passing coolant through, but instead of leaking out the weep hole, it was pushing into the crankcase and mixing coolant with our oil. So you guys ready for the joke? The previous owner stuck this stick up the weep hole to plug it because he noticed coolant leaking and he found this hole it was leaking out of. So he plugged a stick up in it so he wouldn't have a coolant leak anymore. But then that caused coolant from just draining out into the open to then draining and mixing into our oil. And I do think I remember the previous owner telling me when I was buying this machine that the water pump was leaking, but then he sealed the leak and I was good to go in that department. But now I found out you just stuck a dumb little stick in a hole that's designed to leak if your water pump goes bad. So I got that stick removed, but the water pump is still worn out. So I do have a new water pump ordered. So we'll wait for that to ship in. It has to come all the way from China, so it's gonna be a while. So I'm gonna just put everything together. And now that our weep hole will function properly, it'll just drip some coolant while I'm running this machine. But at least I can run it long enough to move it around where I need to and not have it blocking the shop anymore. So let's work on putting this back together. Got to reinstall the air compressor, the oil cooler, and then the valve cover. And then we'll be back running. So kind of annoying what happened. Obviously not a big deal if a water pump fails. But for that being the reason that coolant was pushing into oil because my weep hole was plugged was pretty funny. But I would much rather have water pump issues than head gasket issues. So it sounds like our head gasket's fine. And then we can just continue on with this being a wonderful machine. Only paid $5 grand for this machine and it's 60,000 pounds. So it's been a wonderful purchase. Been very handy. I'm gonna get this oil cooler dropped in here. It's probably easier to get it going before the compressor gets back in here. Get all these bolts started in here. Now this compressor can get back in here. Okay, I pretty much have everything unhooked from this engine. All that's left is the motor mounts as well as the drive line. I want to get pulled out now too. So got this jack down here because these U-joints are typically a pain to pop out. But I think I can push up with this piece of wood and pop that U-joint cap out. Nice, there it comes already. It's normally much harder than that. That was a good sign. I rotated it to the other side. Nice, that side popped out nice and easy too. Yeah. All right, it's finally out of there. Here's this crossover bar that caps off the transmission. Because right here on the other side is where most of the weight of the engine and transmission is being supported. And it gets cradled in there nicely so it can just lift right out now that we're ready to do our lift. Now we can get a good look at this whole air ride system that supports the front of the cab. And this is very common in modern European trucks where you have airbags on all four corners of the cab for a really nice ride. But Ford was the only American manufacturer to do this on their cab overs. And they did this is a 1978 truck. They were way ahead of their time. And this is why I'm so loyal to Ford cab overs. Some people don't like them because the cab feels really unstable and leans when you go around a curve. And some people don't like that, but the cab is solidly held to the frame of the truck through all this. You have the cab jack ram running right here, so you kind of get this parallelogram feature for this step. Bounce up and down like that. But then also you can apply hydraulic fluid to here, and this whole bracket tilts forward and takes the whole cab with it. And I love how the design functions. I love all the quirks it has and the wiggle it does down the road. And I don't quite understand other people that don't like them for the instability you feel with them. Because the alternative is any other cab over manufacturer that has just a rigid mounted hinge up here, and as a result you break your back with such a rough ride being seated right over this front axle. That's how cab overs got such a bad reputation of being such poor ride quality. But that's not the case at all with these four cab overs with these airbags involved. And what cab overs are really good at is being very efficient with space, which is great for this project here, so that we can have a really long living quarters without having a ridiculously long truck overall. This will still be pretty maneuverable. Here you can also see all this is mounted to this custom cast iron piece, this whole big webbing piece that carries on from the frame and then ties in the front bumper. It has a lot of grime here, so I'm going to clean that up a bit. And then the front of the leaf spring pivots on this pin right here. So I'm going to go through and cut all these hook bolts and get this whole frame side to side. They'll be held together with this cross member, and then undo these leaf spring mounts back here, and then this whole front axle assembly as well as the cab mounts will come out all in one unit. All right, this front axle is all loosened up. The bolts are removed, holding on these rear leaf spring hangers, as well as all the bolts holding on these whole custom brackets, holding the rest of the axle. Only thing that remains is removing this bolt the rest of the way, and this should separate out. So I'm going to get hooked up to the excavator and try to pick these things apart. Alright, the water pump for the excavator ended up shipping in ahead of schedule. So here you can see it here. Here's the old one. You can see that green residue of moisture in the oil. And that gets installed here. The gear goes in this hole, so let's get this installed. It's very late at night right now. I like shifting my sleep schedule a little bit in the summer so I can do more work when it's nice and cool at night. Beat the summer heat. Here you can see the weep hole that we were talking about earlier. So that's where the water will drain if the seal fails. And this one was all full of wood, so I took a drill bit and cleared that out for now, but happy to get this fresh water pump in now. Got a new O-ring laid in right there. And then this is kind of a pain to get started because there's this short stubby hose that it immediately has to plug into. There it goes, kind of. All right, it's finally in there. They definitely make it hard with this short hose that crosses over from the water pump to the thermostat housing. But now that that's all aligned, this will all tighten up easy from here on out. So this HeavyHaul ToterHome is consisting of axles from 4 different Ford cab overs, frames from 2 different 7-ton military trucks, this here cargo box from a cargo truck that I've already converted to full living quarters, decked out with beds, shower, kitchen, toilet, desk, fridges, everything. But that still leaves one critical component left, the heart of it all, the engine. I just bought a truck, paid for the truck, waiting for some paperwork to go through so I can go pick it up. But this truck I'll be robbing the engine out of for this ToterHome. And let's just say it's pretty much the most desirable heavy haul engine ever made, so I'm pretty excited. Drop in the comment if you have any guesses on what that engine might be. So subscribe so you don't miss out on the rest of this build. And also, if you want to hang out for a few more minutes, me and Ron are going to install some new tracks he got for his skid steer, so feel free to hang around for that. Here's the tensioner assembly for that skid steer. This is where the tensioner plunger presses against, and then it has a spring that compresses. And there's supposed to be threads coming off this shaft with a nut that attaches it to the next segment. However, the thread snapped off and this wore down to this point right here. So I'm gonna cut this bolt and weld this together. So we'll have the shaft extended and have some threads on the end again so we can have a nut. Now we have threads sticking beyond the spring. There you can see that weld's on. The lock nut wasn't really locking, so I put a little tack weld on it to hold it steady. Here. I'm getting them all going. Yes, sir. We did it.